Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new or returning, it's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I'll be making an egg from segmented sapele rings and a feature resin insert. This one threw up some challenges around casting the insert and how I was going to hold it all steady in the lathe. So without further ado, let's get into it. You join me whilst I'm passing some timber over the jointer. It takes a while to set up, so I'm doing way more than I need, then I'll have enough for the next 2 or 3 projects. When the timber was flat and square on 2 sides, I moved over to the thicknesser. I got a bit out of sync doing this. I should really have gone to the bandsaw after the jointer to cut each piece down close to the required thickness, then use the thicknesser to true up the remaining unfinished sides, bringing each piece to a consistent size. The bandsaw was next. I cut a number of lengths down to 25mm. This was around the thickness I wanted the segmented rings to be. I could get away with doing it this way because I was going to use a new method to cut the individual segments. And this is my new way of cutting segments. I've made myself a new jig. This is of course the design from Jerry Bennett. It's my first go at making one, and whilst I'm very happy with it, I want to make a few changes to suit my setup, so I fully intend to make another, but for now this will do. The advantage of this design is that the timber stays the same way up for each cut. What that meant for this project was I could glue the segments together with the bandsaw face on top, which would be easy to sand flat later on. It took a while to get used to the new jig. The guide kept sticking in the table rebate and I had to remember to stop flipping the timber over, but it's a vast improvement over my previous setup. When I make a new one, I'll do a video. This project required 7 segmented rings, each with 18 segments, along with the feature resin insert and a solid sapele base and top. With all 126 segments cut, each one was sanded to remove the fluffy edges, then it was time for the glue up. Using my favoured Type 1-2, a liberal amount was added to one side of each segment, then the ring was loosely assembled. As you can see, I got something not quite right. I ended up with a dry joint, but this was quickly remedied with a bit more Type 1-2, and then I could clamp it all together using a hose clamp. The final tightening and a quick wipe down, and that was the first one done. The rest were all completed in the same way, making sure the joints were well saturated in glue and all the segments were as level with each other as possible. So moving on, with all 7 rings placed to one side to cure overnight, I moved on to casting the feature resin insert. For this, I 3D printed a mould. The black inner section I was able to print in one go. The outer exceeded the print size of the printer, so I had to do it in 4 sections. I sanded each piece of the mould to remove the bobbly bits left over from the printing process. I had intended to try to make it reusable, but to be honest, this was the first attempt at using a printed mould, and it was a bit of an experiment, and I half expected the PLA to melt when it was subjected to the heat of the resin curing process. Sanding done, I used superglue and an accelerator to build the mould. Making sure I got plenty on, I fixed each outer section to the inner, trying to keep the joints as tight as possible and not stick my fingers to it in the process. went together really well, better than I'd hoped, each piece lining up perfectly with the next. The printed parts are hollow, so they were a bit flexible, which helped. After the final piece was glued in place, I added more super glue to all the joints to make sure it was sealed. While sealing the joints, I got a bit concerned about it coming apart, so I decided to add a mechanical fixing. This may have been overkill, but better to be safe than sorry. I drilled a series of 2mm holes in each joint. I believe it was a total of 16. Then I added small screws, being careful not to over tighten them. I felt a lot better with it done like this. It didn't stop me adding more super glue, just to be sure, and of course the last screw which I'd forgotten first time round. Now I could get on with casting the feature insert, and this is why I 3D printed a mould. I was trying to save the amount of resin I would need. If I'd used baking moulds, I would have needed twice as much. Doing it this way, I can get much closer to the finished size. For this casting, I only needed 2 batches. The chosen colours were magenta pearl and black pearl. Each batch was thoroughly mixed, then allowed to pre-cure before adding them to the mould. The ambient temperature was in the high 20s, so it didn't take long before the resin began to gel. Then with no time to waste, I filled the mould, alternating the batches to get good colour separation. Though I'd overlooked one thing, I'd sat the mould in a silicone baking tray to catch any leaks, and it's a real struggle to lower it into the pressure pot liner. But with a bit of quick thinking, I overcame that issue, got it sorted and into the pressure pot, added 50 to 55 psi and left it overnight to cure. It's the next day and time to have a look at the casting, and all looked well. There were no leaks. The bit on the outside is where I spilled some pudding into the pot. I removed all the screws and put it to one side. I wanted to get the segmented rings glued up, so it was over to the drum sander to flatten and level each ring. The drum sander really is one of the key pieces of machinery I've purchased. It makes short work of removing material. I just make sure I always use it with good dust extraction, and before each use I clean the sandpaper loading with an abrasive belt cleaner, and so far it's never let me down. So on to the glue up. There was 2 to do. The lower section with 3 segmented rings and the solid base, and the upper section with 4 segmented rings and a solid top. The feature ring would sit between them. After applying a liberal amount of glue, the next ring was placed on top, half bonding the vertical joints. This was followed by hot melt glue to hold them in position, then more tight bond, then the next ring, and more hot melt. This is the lower section, so only 3 rings. I would add the solid base piece later. I placed some weight on top, being careful to keep everything in position till the hot melt glue set, then I moved on to doing the upper section. The upper section was done in just the same way, but with 4 segmented rings. I won't go through it again, so I'll skip to the next bit. I needed to cut the solid base and top pieces. I cut them twice as thick as they needed to be, because these would also have mortises cut into them to hold the workpiece steady on the lathe. The plan was to turn them out as the piece neared completion. With both pieces cut more or less to round, each one was glued onto the respective blank. This is the top. First I drew a circle to hot position it, then more tight bond with hot melt to hold it in place. Weight was added, and when they were both done, I left them overnight to cure. It's now a few days later, and the blanks have had time for the glue to fully cure, and now I could start turning. First up was the base. After fixing the blank firmly in the coal jaws, I used the tailstock to secure it, then I set to with a 3/8 ball gouge, roughly shaping the outer surface. Using a series of push cuts and shear scraping, I began blending the solid base into the segmented rings. At this point I was just trying to get somewhere near so I could cut the mortise. The final shaping would be done later. The mortise was cut in the usual way. First I used a 1/4" parting tool to define the outer edge, then I cleaned out the inner material with a bowl gouge, then cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter, a final tidy up with a gouge, and it was done. I used the tailstock to centre the chuck and hold it firmly in the mortise. After tightening the jaws, I turned the blank around and finished roughly shaping the top segmented ring. It didn't take much to do it. Shear scraping seemed to be the best way to remove the waste. And with that done, I put it to one side and moved on to the next bit. I fixed the resin insert into the coal jaws and began removing the mould. I tried to get it off, but it was well and truly bonded to the resin, so turning it off was the only way to do it. The coal jaws had a really good hold on the workpiece, but I couldn't use a tailstock to pin it in place, so I had to be very careful. When I was working on the end, pushing against the chuck, it was okay, but when I started applying pressure to cut away the outer layers of the mould, well, that was another thing entirely. I opted to use the 1/4" parting tool to reduce the chance of getting a catch with, say, a bowl gouge, which could potentially rip the insert off the chuck and send it flying to who knows where. Using the parting tool, I gently removed 5mm sections, working my way from the top down to the base. After removing most of the outer mould, I then had to remove the inner section, but unfortunately in my haste to get it done, I didn't check the camera angle, so all you can see of that is the back of my right arm. So swiftly moving on, with the inner removed, I turned the insert around and using a thin parting tool, I cut away the bottom flange of the mould. The bit that was left I removed with a negative rate scraper, the parting tool and the skew. And after flattening the underside with a skew, it was done. I refixed the lower segmented section to the lathe and set to levelling the top ring, ready to fix the resin insert in place. To fix the insert to the segmented lower section, I mixed a small amount of rapid setting epoxy resin coloured with black mica powder. I spread an even layer on the face of the insert, then used a tailstock to keep the two pieces centred and apply the necessary pressure until the epoxy had cured. After making sure there were no more voids in the joint, I left it for 30 minutes till it was fully bonded. The rapid set epoxy had cured, leaving a solid bonded joint, so I began blending the featured insert into the segmented lower section. For a start, I used the bowl gouge to shear scrape, but this started to chip the resin, so I switched to the skew chisel. This was much better. I was able to strip away thin layers of material, gradually refining the shape. I could have done this later, but I was keen to see the shape develop. It's the first large egg I've made, so I was still working out the best way to do it. And I had a few open joints in the segments, which were concerning me a bit. But as I took more off, the voids disappeared. Anyway, that was enough for now. The inside was next. I could have left it roughed and unworked. After all, with the top glued on, it would never be seen again. But I would know, and I wanted it to be right. So with the tailstock and the coal jaws removed, I set about cleaning it up. Once again, my camera angle was a bit off, so there isn't a lot to see. The hollowing out was done first with a bowl gouge, then negative rate scrapers. I left some thickness to the resin insert. I wasn't sure how much I would need to remove from the outside to achieve the shape I was looking for. And after sanding to 400 grit, I applied a finish just to the inside, topped off with Wood Wax 22. Whilst I had the opportunity, I cleaned up the gluing face on the resin, and then it was time to do the upper segmented section. I fixed the upper section in the coal jaws and began roughly getting it into shape. The plan here was to get it balanced and in the process remove the steps in the segmented rings. With that done, I was then going to cut a temporary mortise, but in the end I decided to do something different. Project was all coming together quite nicely. I'd hung back on doing it because of one thing or another, and in the end I needn't have worried. Now the outside was roughly shaped and balanced, I made a bit of a change. Instead of a mortise, I decided to use a tenon. I figured it would be easier to do and easier to cut away when I didn't need it anymore. I turned the blank around and fixed the tenon in the 4-jaw chuck, and then set about finishing the outside, cutting away the flat spots and getting the lower ring to round. The inside was done the same as the lower section, and once again I screwed up the camera angle, so I'll skip ahead to the next bit. With the inside done, I levelled the face ready for gluing on the lower section, then I sanded just the inside from 80 to 400 grit. Sanding done, I applied a finish, again topped off with Wood Wax 22. Now I could join the two sections together, the same as before, using rapid setting epoxy mixed with black mica powder. This was slightly different in that I had to make sure the vertical joints lined up across the insert, but that done, I left it to cure for 30 minutes. After the epoxy had cured, I could get on with the final shaping. The workpiece was held between a chuck at either end. The top of the egg is nearest to the camera. I thought about making a template to help me shape the profile, but with the way the blank was being held, I wouldn't have been able to use it, so I decided against it. I used the skew to do most of the shaping, with a bit of work from the bowl gouge to remove the heavier ridges. It's hard to see from this angle, but there was some of the mould still attached to the resin, and that had to be removed, which required me to cut deeper into the surface. Remember what I said about leaving it thick? Well, it seems to have been a good idea. But now I'd done as much as I could on the upper section, so I turned my attention to the base. I removed the chuck from the mortise and used the skew to blend and fair the surface, round from the edge of the rebate up into the midsection. The shape was very close to where it needed to be, so it didn't take too long to do. I also decided I would leave the mortise in the finished piece, so I tidied it up and added a few decorative rings. And that was the base more or less done. I sanded with 80 grit to check for tool marks, then I went back to work on the upper section. Clamping the egg between the two chucks, and with the base now done, I could better see how the upper section should look. Using the gouge in the skew, I began shaping the upper profile, stopping frequently to check my progress. The skew gave me the best control fine-tuning the surface, though what I haven't shown is how many times I sharpen it, and for the last few passes I used the 1000 grit diamond sharpening stone to give it a really good cutting edge. A few more passes and that bit was done. Then concentrating on the lower and halfway up the upper section, I sanded from 80 to 600 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit on the resin midsection. Then I applied a finish just to the lower segmented section, topped off with Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. And then with the workpiece turned around, I could remove the tenon and finish shaping the top. Until most of the shaping had been done, I erred on the side of caution and used the tailstock for added security. The bowl gouge took care of the heavier cuts, but I went back to the skew to do the shaping. The thin parting tool took care of the last little nubbins on top, and with the tailstock out of the way, I could finish the shaping. A few gentle swipes to remove the excess, and it was done. I sanded the upper section, blending the grit down towards the midsection, being careful not to scratch the resin. After sanding, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. This was quickly followed by 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Up next, Yorkshire grit. A single coat, thoroughly cleaned away, till no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Next, the resin polishing. First to go is Mirka Polarshine 10. A single coat, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polarshine 5, another single coat, buffed to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. 2 coats, polished off to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished. My first large egg, and this one took some doing. From 3D printing the resin mould to working out how best to hold it on the lathe, all coming together at the end to make something really nice. I like it a lot, and I hope you like it too. I've got some ideas for doing another, so watch out for that in an upcoming video. But with all that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. A thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.